Hello, everyone. My name is Sherrod Davis. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders at Ecomap Technologies. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's edition of Ecosystem Talks. We're going to have a masterclass led by Chris Link, CEO of Technically. Technically is a news organization that connects and challenges a community of technologists and entrepreneurs who are invested in their local communities. Chris is also the founder of Philly Tech Week, one of the country's largest and longest running open innovation festivals, Baltimore Innovation Week as well, Klein News Innovation Camp, and other events that bring smart people and ecosystems together. Additionally, Chris is a longtime publisher of generosity.org, a nonprofit and philanthropy news site. I'm really excited for this one, Chris. We've gotten to know each other over the past few years, and really pumped to hear you talk a bit about how to craft a compelling ecosystem story that drives collaboration and ecosystem growth. Chris, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Sherrod. Thanks, Ecomap Squad. I'm thrilled to be here. Ooh, on the wrong microphone. Let me flip it over. Yeah, that worked? Hello, everyone. Thrilled to be here. I'm going to say the sentence that everyone most appreciates in a webinar. I'm going to pull up some slides, but we're not going to bore you to death because the chat will be active so we can get very specific on what you are experiencing. Actually, like, I think as you roll in, please put in your chart, like in the chat, where you're coming from. I can cater and specify recommendations as much as possible. So please do. If you want the most out of your time, tell me where you're coming from, and I'll keep the chat active as best I can. Because at the end of the day, it's what we should do. All right. So goal here is to talk ecosystem storytelling, but let me start with some assumptions about you guys. And again, as you come in, drop in the chat where you're coming from. My job is to make sure you don't drift away and start checking your email. I know right now, email or that ham sandwich that's in front of you is calling your name. I'm going to try to keep your attention. So drop in the chat if I can see it, where you are coming from organizationally or geography wise, so I can specify recommendations. But as I do that, let me guess a couple things. You have, wherever you are, I don't even know where you are. I don't even know where you are, but I bet you have some space in your ecosystem that looks like this, which, by the way, in a couple decades, this will be to millennials what this was to an entire generation in the 70s. This is just millennial chic decor that is now essentially ubiquitous around the world in ecosystem stuff. And I bet a bunch of other things are things you would say about your ecosystem right now. I bet you say, we got tons of events. We have some researchers doing really cool cutting edge stuff. We got great proximity to this other bigger market, but we're actually way more affordable. We have this little pocket of density. Some new warehouses have been renovated. We got great arts and culture. You can even go out and access a particular part of the outdoors that our part of the country is known for. And we have some customers here, unlike those other places. Meanwhile, we're a smaller pond than the big places, and we can really let you thrive. The only thing holding us back is if we had a few more investors, just a little bit more talent, and we just had a couple more high profile deals, we would be great. I suspect you say that because the reality is that is just about everyone else. It's a near universal reality of ecosystems around the country and increasingly around the world. That's why so much ecosystem storytelling is garbage, because it's deeply undifferentiated. So today we're going to hopefully talk a little bit about how to do that slightly better. This is the team over at Technically. I put a green circle around my mustachioed face from last December. We're celebrating 15 years of publishing. We're a news organization. So at the high level, I'm a journalist and entrepreneur dude. We had technically been around 15 years, cover daily multiple markets: Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Delaware, Philly, Pittsburgh, and have then pop-up projects in another dozen or so markets around the country, primarily cover technologists and entrepreneurs. You can subscribe to our newsletter, and you should come out to Philly, where we're hosting our big annual conference May 9th. So that's us. A couple of ticky-tack points, and then we're going to go into the basics. That's our audience. We don't really care about that. That's what we do. We don't really care about that. Here's the agenda. The fine marketing team at Ecomap put out some very high standards for me that I'm intending to deliver. This is what the marketing material that brought you here today. So I'm gonna deliver it. Help you talk about articulating the unique value for your ecosystem. We're gonna do that. We're gonna talk about captivating your audience with a narrative that resonates. Have a couple little tactics for that. And then what? How do you attract those key partners and drive meaningful collaborations? And these are 3 check marks that the Ecomap squad is going to make sure that I deliver, or I'll get in trouble. I'm going to get you some proven frameworks for crafting those stories. Going to get you a couple of examples of how to tell stories and a couple actionable steps to implement them. You'll get all that. A couple last points that you should think about in all of your ecosystem storytelling. The terms are still a little bit murky. I suspect when all of you go into different meetings, you do some version of innovation ecosystem, innovation community. You might use startup ecosystem in some places. You might mean tech economy, tech community. We often use tech economy. We talk about workforce and entrepreneurship, but the reality is this is somewhat interchangeable, and that is itself how you tell a story. So let's start with some basics on articulating the unique value that your ecosystem offers. I want to start with a couple stories that I think stories do a good job of this work. So some of you may recognize these 3 one-time Maryland high school students that rented a house out in Silicon Valley and started a company that came to be known FiscalNote out of Metro DC. It's still a well-established set of software that helps predict and make analysis of policy making's process. They grew real fast in the late 2010s to the thrill of a DC startup ecosystem. They went public last year, and for some, this is an incredible story. This is just the kind of story that Metro startup ecosystems around the country want to talk about, but it had like an uncomfortable story too. And I want to use this story to talk about how you might tell a story about your ecosystem. So this is a chart that we technically did where we took a whole bunch of the dozen or so DC tech unicorns that had been valued at least $1 billion or more at the height of the pandemic's valuation craze in 2022. And there was FiscalNote at 1.3 billion. This sounds like a great story initially for the DC metro region. Then we technically came as a news organization. We were annoying at first because we went and pointed out after FiscalNote went public, the world went through a valuation collapse, as many of you know. And today, FiscalNote trades at about $150 million, a tenth of what it was nearly valued a year ago. And we use it as a story to explain how tech unicorns are a bit of a mirage right now because so many private companies raised a boatload of money at low interest rates, and they have a big runway, and they haven't had to go back to the markets yet. And so they can still, on paper, look like they're worth more than $1 billion. And so we put it as a negative story. And then I got a message from someone in the DC ecosystem was like, you dummy, you have completely misunderstood the DC narrative. The DC narrative should be, holy heck, look at how many could be tech unicorns the DC ecosystem has. That's the story that we should be telling at DC, at a DC. And whether I agree with that or not, that for me was like a really great example of how the data underpinning anything can be turned into a story depending on what story you want to tell. It could be, gee golly, 10 years ago, DC would have loved to have so many vibrant tech software companies that could have been valued at $1 billion or more. Me, mean old journalist, came in and did a story about what wasn't working. That valuation had collapsed, which is true. But I got pushed on, we have to tell a better story out of the DC metro region. That's the email I got. And I think that is an example of how you have to start telling your own unique story. Let me get a little more specific in case that was too vague. We had technically tried to do a bunch of this. We just dropped in December these reports in each of the markets that we report daily in, state of local tech economies, where we try to take data and stories and piece it together to try to get to something resembling a unique narrative. Because as shared earlier, most ecosystems are not saying anything particularly unique. So we try to distill what we're seeing makes up an innovation ecosystem, a startup ecosystem, however you want to use these terms. We use 5 big buckets. There's a lot of words. You can screenshot it or whatever. Don't stress. In all those reports we have greater detail. But at the high level, invention, where ideas come from, which often means research, but it can mean any kind of idea generation activity. The commercialization, how that those businesses come to be created, all the entrepreneurs I suspect most of you want to support. The workforce that has to exist to be employed and power those businesses. And a couple things I think people overlook. The lifestyle. Why does anyone want to live where you're trying to develop an ecosystem? And the reputation of your ecosystem. Because the reality of a place and its reputation doesn't always exactly map. I might even say often it doesn't map. And so the reputation work, which is often powered by storytelling, has to be informed by, but is somewhat different than these other assets. And step one in understanding your unique value prop is looking at your ecosystem in this kind of way, in these buckets or another framework that you might prefer, and saying, where are we strong or not? We at Techly, for our communities, are doing more of this kind of granular analysis of in these areas, what ecosystems are doing better or worse, where can people grow or not, and it's something that we at Techly hope to help more ecosystems do. And so, like, there's lots of pretty charts about how you think of a startup ecosystem or an innovation ecosystem or whatever. Here's my chart. There's 100 of these, so I wouldn't worry too much. We at the center put those entrepreneurs and the tech workers. Just for tech workers, just basically mean the people who help grow those companies. We put them at the very center, and you got this like orbit of stuff around it. And you guys know this, but the bottom part of it, the storytelling, as any of you who know me or follow technically know, we think this bottom part is the thing that people routinely overlook, that they put so much work into building out their entrepreneur support organizations, or like making sure the big corporates are engaged, or they host their little events, or they get investors to come out, or they're working with workforce programs to be informed by what employers need. But they often overlook, like, how does anyone know any of this is happening? And that includes both locally and outside of it. I'll actually go back to this slide. And if you look at the reputation, that green bottom of this chart, when we analyzed our markets, we looked at both what insiders say, the actual leaders of a local ecosystem, what locals say, people who live in that place but aren't deeply involved in the ecosystem, and what others say, people who know about ecosystems but aren't informed on that geography. Those three are 3 different ways to understand your regional employer brand, as it were, your regional ecosystem reputation. And that storytelling, we find, is the foundation of advancing that work. So you have to get a unique understanding of how you do it. And so, like, I think of this as, like, if you think your regional brand could interest everyone, your regional brand sucks, because that isn't what a brand should do. A brand should have some specification, like my reader who emailed me and called me a dummy for my DC Tech Unicorn story. The way that person thought of it is, hey, if you don't want to be in the brainiest region in the country, yeah, we're expensive, but we have a flourishing of do-goodery, brain power, and this flourishing tech unicorn community. If you don't want that, you shouldn't come. That person did have a strong sense of TC's identity and did not think that everyone should be there. So I would strongly encourage you to write out your sentence or two of why you think someone should live in your ecosystem or be involved in your ecosystem. And if it could interest everyone, it's a bad one. It's no good. I'm obsessed with this little story. This is an incomplete story, but we had technically, as part of a big reporting project, engaged a bunch of stakeholders to imagine Philadelphia in 150 years, long-term future. By the way, I'd love to do more of this work for many of your own communities. And you don't have to read this thing. Don't worry. You don't have to scramble to read it because it's incomplete, but it's just an example. We did this exercise where we got a bunch of people to contribute to write a vision statement of Philadelphia in 150 years. And toward the end of the process, someone said, "Oh, I still want people in 150 years to be living in a place that we'd still recognize as Philadelphia." And then we had this stakeholder meeting, which we were essentially talking about this region's differentiation. And we talked for like 20 minutes as a group in this meeting of, like, what do we even mean by what is distinctly Philadelphia? And we ended up with a sentence that closes this draft vision of "we will still boo you." And for any of you who do or don't know Philadelphia, may know, like, you may hate that. You may not want to live in a place that will boo its own heroes, and that's fine, but it's a distinction. And as silly as that might be, I think that is so important to get, that your regional ecosystem narrative should not be welcoming to everyone. It shouldn't be. It should be something that is distinctive to your place. And if it isn't, then it isn't any good. So that's step one, that you're going to get your unique value prop. Write it out, write a few sentences, and decide, would this turn some people off and attract others? Then that's getting closer. What do you do with that? That's step two, as the EcoMap friends put it to me. Let's talk about, how do you captivate? What are some tactics? So to do that, I want to tell you the story about how I met Ice-T. Likely you know Ice-T. Perhaps you know him from hip hop fame. Perhaps you know him from Law and Order SVU fame. But about a decade ago, I was speaking at an event in Boston, and I was doing a kind of an overview on how startups could pitch earned media, could pitch journalists. And so I did my little talk, and by just programming coincidence, I was the last everyday speaker. And then the keynote, Ice-T was after me. And as I was finishing up my talk, Ice-T and his entourage, there was an entourage, came late, or came into the room before I was done, and was sitting in the back of the room for the tail end of my presentation. So then Ice-T comes up for the keynote, and a few minutes in, he goes, reminds me of what that reporter was saying. Nobody gives a fuck about you. Sorry if you're in an office and I just swore really loudly. But Ice-T communicated in a sentence what I tried to spend 20 minutes telling a bunch of entrepreneurs, which was, no one actually cares about your story. We feel deeply committed to our personal story, our regional brand story, our company story, and we think it's incredible. All of the hard obstacles that we overcame as individuals, all the twists and turns of our company, all of the quirks of our region, we assume by definition that our individual story matters. As I tried to put it, as Ice-T put it better, nobody cares. And so storytelling is the art form of trying to collect something that feels very specific, but can interest and broaden its reach. In some sense, that is at core what storytelling is. It's not this happened and then that happened. Storytelling is the ordering of information in a way that pulls people into the conversation. And that is what you're doing when you're trying to tell your regional employer brand. So let's take Ice-T's advice and help you do a better job of making people care a bit more about you. So let's use the TED example. I imagine everyone on this webinar has watched a TED Talk. And TED has been so successful a brand over the last 20 years that it's trolled in internet memes, like this great one from Reddit, spoofing how generic TED Talks are, right? Like in this meme, the classic meme figure is giving generic advice, and an audience feels like it's breathtaking. But actually, I think this is saying something very smart about storytelling, because TED has their TED commandments, and I've been in many a meeting where a very earnest person was bowled over by the TED commandments, kind of rules for a great TED Talk. But journalist person over me has always been really taken by how the TED commandments, or any TED Talk, follows a very straightforward structure that basically any 17-year-old journalism student is familiar with. It's called the inverted pyramid in our land, but it's a story tactic that is familiar for almost any story that is trying to convey fact-based information. So not necessarily your novel writing, but for an article format, a video piece, even a podcast, it tends to follow something like this, the inverted pyramid. And it's super simplified here, but here's what that inverted pyramid looks like. Top of the funnel, the widest point, in the case of a feature lead, it's a person story. It's something that the most compelling story, or the funniest or the quirkiest, that might draw the most people in. Ice-T is more interesting than me, and so Ice-T is a better feature lead. It's a big, wide point, the widest group of people would find interesting. And whenever you do your regional ecosystem storytelling, that's what you start with. What's the biggest thing? It might be your San Diego beaches or your Chicago food culture or Baltimore live work balance, whatever your biggest story is. And then you move down to what journalists call nut graph, but more putly, it's just the data that backs up whatever you're saying. It's like a little drier, it's a little more boring, but it's what proves this to be true. So San Diego beaches are marvelous. That nut graph might say why the data prove that people are flocking to San Diego's ecosystem because it's a great place to live. That nut graph. The body is mixing the two together. That individual person's story, let's just say Rudy moved to San Diego for the startup ecosystem, but really was for the beaches. The body of that story would interplay. Why did Rudy come to San Diego? Why does she represent San Diego's ecosystem more generally? And then a kicker is the end of the story, something that gives us a satisfying end that connects back to that lead, that satisfies our very old storytelling brains, because we want to see a beginning, middle, and end. We want to see a character arc, and it brings us through information along the way. This inverted pyramid, you can Google it and go a lot deeper, gets you like 60% of the way of understanding all fact-based storytelling ever. Any TED Talk you listen to is probably going to start with a personal anecdote. This powerful thing happened to me. Then a nut graph. That thing that happened to me happens to many people. The body, interplaying some research and my personal experience in with the broader point. And then a kicker. I return to an emotional end to give you a strong close. That's just like almost all storytelling in the kind of like fact-based or informational gathering way. There's people play with it. There's different ways to go at it, but this gets you pretty close to understanding what so much storytelling is, because it's effective. There's a little bit of an intense chart. Sorry, I have a lot of intense charts from different talks I do, but sure, I'd call it a master class, so I get to throw the deep stuff at you. This is like a trope. You've probably heard this trope, but I want to pull out a piece of why we tend to talk about content. And I think when we talk about storytelling, content usually comes to mind. But let's like pause this for a second. So the trope goes, a way to understand marketing is to pretend that a circus is coming to town. And you put up a billboard, that's advertising, right? You're buying space that interrupts attention, and it says a fact-based thing is happening. That's advertising. Publicity is doing something quirky that's going to basically get other people's attention. Could be earned media, it could be social media at this point, but it's a thing you do. So like in this case, you put the billboard on an elephant and you have the elephant walk through the town. That's publicity to promote that circus. Social and content strategy would be make sure you're getting the photo or video, creating content, explaining the process and the meaning, telling the stories of why you decided to have this circus come to town. That's social and content strategy. Then you have managing the criticism that the elephant was mistreated. It's crisis comms, like, oh, something broke, something bad happened. How do we explain and tell that story? It's crisis comms. And then you pitch all this stuff to existing media or increasingly creators, individual people who already have audiences. That's your public relations and press outreach. And then you put that all together, that's marketing. And for our purposes of regional economic storytelling, you'd say all of this is how you talk about your regional ecosystem brand or even your individual ecosystem kind of group's efforts. And so we're going to zoom in, and we are zooming in on that third line, the social and content strategy, because it's in the web publishing age, it's the lowest barrier to entry that can tend to get you the most gains most quickly. If you have a small budget, you might not have an advertising budget, or you might not be able to do big stunts that are publicity, though there's cost-effective ways to do them, by the way. You hopefully don't have crisis comms problems, and you might not yet be doing a ton of PR and press outreach, though you might have a PR team that does that. So that's why we're zooming a bit in on social and content strategy specifically. So let's talk about a couple of tools that you have, because I promised the EcoMap I'd get really specific for our masterclass, and again, take questions here or separately. There's a few common distribution tools. These aren't all of them, but I wanted to share with when you begin to talk of like All right, step one, I have a unique sense of my region. I've done some work to understand its strengths. Then what? Let's go into some specifics. So distribution. You might already have a newsletter. It's good because you have an own relationship with people over time that might have interest in it. The con, of course, is that consistency is hard, not heard. Consistency is hard. And most newsletters are so boring, as many of you know, because most of them are just, we have the marketing coordinator on it and she's got to send it once a month. So she just blasts it out to a bunch of people we put on a list to make sure that the boss is happy. Terrible. But that's a failure of a lot of newsletters. You could have a site. We're going to turn up a content site. We're going to launch a blog. We're going to have articles. We're going to gather multimedia. The pro is that you're collecting evergreen assets. You might be getting people's stories, putting them in a blog format or on your website or something like that. Really valuable to have those assets. You can use those assets. You can repurpose them in other places. You can send them out in a newsletter or on social or whatever. The con is that it's really hard to grow audience. I've been doing 15 years of growing audience on ecosystem storytelling because so I know that it's hard to do that over time. Again, the consistency is hard. Social video, which is where a lot of folks are playing different social platforms. Social video right now is very popular, but let's just call it social strategy more generally. The pros, it's like a real low barrier to entry. Hey, let's throw the intern on a new IG Reel strategy. Like you can start real quick, but you got little control. Didn't have no direct relationship with these people, right? You're renting an audience from Instagram. You don't own it in the same way that you do with a newsletter. Or a podcast is another example of a thing that people like right now. It's a well-liked, it's pretty flexible format, but it's hard and expensive to do really well, which is why we're glutted with so many bad podcasts. It's just to like an executive wants the opportunity to hear him or herself talk. That's why the podcast exists. But these are all distribution tools. And I want to make a real clear point here between the creation of storytelling and the distribution of the storytelling, which I think is one point that I hope you really get from this gathering, because people will muddle them a bunch. And you need both. They're two different steps. The creation, which we'll get to next. This is the distribution. How does anyone know about it? It's why like earned media generally and why we technically try to exist. We think people don't get the distribution part right ever. They might throw it on social, but they don't have any audience to speak of, or they're not creating stories that compel, or they haven't the capacity to build that relationship over time. But you got to care about distribution. Why does anyone know about the work you're doing? Let's talk about what those stories can look like. Ecomap promised you framework, so I wanted to give some. There's 1,000 of these. You can Google them, but I wanted to just like run through a couple examples of little things you could start. These are all things that we technically have done. They're basically a little series, but I think they would also convey how you could begin to think about reinforcing your ecosystem's unique differentiation. That's why that's step one, right? You have to first know what is true and powerful and effective about our ecosystem, and then you use stories to reinforce again and again that ecosystem story that you have. So here are a couple example storytelling frameworks you could use. We've for years done something called entrance exam, which is just when someone moved to your ecosystem, you just talk to them why. Just talk to them about why. You set up 5 to 10 repeat questions. You ask them every time, and you can just collect stories of why did someone move here. It really tends to reinforce. They often teach you what your region's strengths really are. Trend stories, which just is like, hey, what is a hard thing that is happening or our community's thinking about? We do a lot of this as a news org, but you could do it too. I put a screenshot there. Our Technically's fabulous reporter, Holly Quinn in Delaware did a big story around the EDA Tech Hubs deadline, where Delaware was really trying to soul search on, was it part of the Philly metro region? Some of southern Delaware drifted to the Eastern Shore, Maryland. Should they identify there? She took a lot of that local community introspection and put it into a story that was powerful and also did reinforce what was unique and special about Delaware. Data explained. I'm sure all of you are awash with data. This new pitch book released on VC numbers, or the story on the number of entrepreneurs. People are overwhelmed with data. So storytelling is really effective to try to interpret that data. Okay, this new venture report came out. Well, what's a person's story who helps interpret or make sense of that data trend? Oh, the VC was up, VC was down. Why? Let's use a person's story to help us get there. How I got here is a series that we do a ton. That other screenshot there of a Pittsburgh technologist there with President Biden. That is a series we call How I Got Here, but this is like a very trod format, which is just what's your career path? So you could simply do like we want to cover entrepreneurs or tech workers or whomever. How did you get to your job? That definitely reinforces both career accessibility, but also reinforces your regional kind of strengths and who makes up those leadership. Lemonade Stand is a series we did for many years. It's still, I think, effective. Just went to a bunch of entrepreneurs and what was your first childhood business? Get some old photos that again would very much reinforce community identity, can reinforce what's unique and special to your place. Code Annotated. This was the one that we actually didn't do as much as I wanted. I'm a nerdly obsessed with this category, but getting people to explain a very specific technical solve. Actually, university communications departments, I think, tend to do this sometimes. I think they sometimes do it really well when researchers have done something really clever. But I think for many of you, for your ecosystems, I'm sure you have entrepreneurs or technologists that are solving very interesting, very big problems. Get them to explain, like to a 10-year-old what they're solving. So there's a ton of these, but I wanted to like share like example. These are all creation frameworks. They're just different ways to get at people stories that can reinforce your unique value prop as a region or ecosystem. I just grabbed some screenshots from stories that we've done that hopefully might visualize this. So in Miami, we talked to a bunch of immigrant entrepreneurs because Miami has outsized immigrant entrepreneurship rates. So to reinforce that, talked to a bunch of immigrant entrepreneurs about why they're in Miami. It reinforced that. Philadelphia has a strong life sciences reputation. Great reporter Sarah Huffman did a really great deep dive about why now. I filed an item there in Birmingham, Alabama, as they came out of the pandemic and talked about what was distinct about their ecosystem. And Baltimore's own McKeever Conwell, an investor now that we cover and have covered for 15 years, his rise. We did a story about his personal journey. Did very well in editorial or in audience ways, but also clearly reinforced the stars of the Baltimore ecosystem. So these are all different frameworks that are all essentially reinforcing a region's ecosystem strengths. We do lists. I think these are, everyone does some version of honoring individual people. Ours are called realists, where we honor entrepreneurs and highly connected people and engineers and give out awards. But I think you can think about these as people who represent your brand, and that is what your ecosystem is. It's a brand. We do a bunch of data work over it technically, but again, like just probably echoing or hitting home this point that you as a storyteller could sit with data about your region and then try to interpret it so people can better understand it. And examples of newsletters that we've done, blah, blah, blah. All right, I want to leave time for real deeper questions. I have a couple more points, but warning, if you don't prepare some questions, we will sit and stare at each other in awkward silence. We'll meditate or I will sing. So that's a warning to you to prepare a couple questions lest I perform. But the last kind of big high level point that the EcoMap folks kind of highlighted for me helpfully as a framework for the masterclass was basically like, then what? So I want to touch a little bit on the then what, but I definitely do want to get at what you guys might want to get at for your own ecosystem experience. So how essentially do you attract key partners and drive meaningful collaborations? So I put this as like a then what bucket, which we can like talk about for a second. So I broke these down a little bit by the format. We technically find at least 1 in 10 of the newsletter subscribers for any of our local markets does not live in that market. So by, to answer the question of how do you attract partners and drive meaningful collaborations, we consistently find there are lurkers. Wherever your region is, there is someone who has some relationship to it. They might have family there, their partner or spouse might have grown up there, they might have gone to university, in your region. They might like a sports team. There's any number of reasons why they might be broadly interested. And so when you begin to tell stories over time, if you make a newsletter that people want to consume, we find that you just gather people over time who are interested in learning more about that given region. So that's just content marketing 101, right? Of building a warm relationship over time. You can think of those storytelling assets as repurposable. That we have stories in our archives going back years that are still well trafficked because they answered a darn question or they represented a thing. So you using any of those storytelling frameworks to get at a point about your ecosystem is a really natural way to create value today, but then also have an asset that lasts for a long time. And you could then use that story, right? If you were doing targeted outreach to business attraction for business attraction purposes, you could repurpose in a LinkedIn DM a story you told over here. So like you might take that story about Rudy moving to San Diego, you take that story link in your LinkedIn DM, you said, oh, hey, Sharad, I saw that you posted recently about moving to California. I thought you might be interested in the story we wrote about Rudy. You are using kind of storytelling assets to reinforce a brand that is essentially a business attraction strategy, and it works. The idea of like branding, surveying, regional NPS, I know this might be more expensive than some ecosystems can do, but there's often a chamber of commerce or an economic development group that exists to do this sort of thing. So you can work or unite with them to do like branding or surveying sentiment analysis of outside of the region and in-house in your region. Net promoter scores are increasingly being used to understand a regional reputation, which I think is vital. You're basically trying to see over time, can stories fill a narrative of what is happening in a given place? And not to go overly granular, but to anyone, I would say that like this is a marketing strategy, depending on wherever you're coming from, a particular university or an entrepreneur support organization or an economic development group, or you're just like a civic-minded technologist. If you care about your ecosystem's reputation, then you're exercising in a sales and marketing strategy. So you could track marketing qualified leads and conversions like any other marketing strategy. You just create a funnel. So you might count your newsletter subscribers perhaps as a way to understand your conversion, or events, people who want to come to your conference perhaps, or some summit you do in your city. You might create and bring together stars from outside the region and want to bring them together in your venue and test conversion rate. How many people do we have to reach out to before we can get someone to convert? That's all data that you can create and mirror lessons learned from traditional sales and marketing efforts. And so when I look at the question of how do you attract key partners and drive meaningful collaborations, you have to think about this like any sales and marketing effort. That storytelling goes back to that earlier marketing slide, is a component in how you're trying to shape your ecosystem's reputation. And we fortunately, because of sales and marketing, have good evidence that this works, that storytelling is vital. Content marketing has grown as a sales tool because it's effective. It's both cost effective and has long-term narrative change. It just takes an investment in it. So last couple points, and then I'll take some cues. Three kind of like quick things to take away: that you're going to start with benchmarking yourself to that earlier point of what is unique about your region. I always think look at 3 to 5 peer communities that aren't you, but also look at yourself going back in the past by 3 to 5 measures. So look externally, but also look internally, I think is always necessary to understand how you're going to shape your regional brand. You're going to determine an investment, but make it an investment that can last. I think you don't want to do any storytelling effort if it can't last a year. So if you're going to launch an effort to do storytelling, make it last a year, but you can do micro tests. I've always been taught and reminded that you don't want to do any tests less than 90 days, particularly on like storytelling tools. So you might say, all right, well, we have a broad storytelling goal. that we want to begin to tell our region's story on our ecosystem story. So you might set out a goal of like, all right, well, we have to commit to at least a year. I think like the year is your minimum. I honestly think you should probably be talking 2 to 3 years, but at minimum a year. And then like, what are some 90-day tests you might want to do inside of that? I think you probably want a distribution tool that lasts, like a newsletter. You might already have a newsletter, but say we want to step up our game and want it to not be boring. And we're going to do 90-day tests by trying some people stories in every newsletter and see, does that increase whichever preferred metric we might have. And then I would lastly make sure you're testing your storytelling formats. So that includes both the frameworks, what kinds of stories you're telling, and the distribution. How are we getting them out? Those are two different parts of that puzzle, but it all goes back to that unique value prop. So those are the key takeaways that I'd have. I think we should go do stuff. That's my lasting slide. But point of a master class should be like, let's go solve anyone's individual problems. So I would love additional thoughts, or I can just dance, baby dance. I'll do it. We're at 15 years, so you can do stuff with us, but hey, that's me. Alternately, if there are no cues, I can call out some examples we've had in the past. I can do that. Another path would be, I was going to say to like any of our EcoMap friends, if there are examples that you've seen from other like folks in the EcoMap community that have had questions before, like talk about them. But I got a great question from Anand. Anand asked, what do you think of the Baltimore story as you see it right now? So I love that phrase, Baltimore story. And depending on where any of you are coming geographically, you could put any city story. Because funny thing about the story is there is no such thing as one story, right? Baltimore is a city that continues to lose population in a state that is moderately growing. It's a city that has had some economic loss in a region that has been economically strong. So you can choose which story you want, right? And my answer, we technically been reporting in Baltimore for almost 15 years. Baltimore's going to come to a decision point. And by the way, I think this is true for any of you across your geographies. A bunch of you will know that I nerdily obsess over the idea that we expect the world population to begin to decline in the next 30 to 50 years. So for cities that continue to decline, Baltimore being an example of one, Pittsburgh being an example of one, many of our Northeast and Midwest cities, when you keep declining, you have a question of can we own that and say, well, this is where the world is growing, but our ecosystem can still be a point of growth, but we have to redouble that. Do we own that narrative, or are we trying to change that narrative? And I think that's a key point that any region has. Are we going to own our narrative or change our narrative? Is Philadelphia going to own that they boo people, or are they going to try to change that narrative? And that is a hinge point that so many stories have. So in Baltimore's specific case, it is part of one of the brainiest states in the country. It is one of the highest share of college-educated Black residents. Baltimore City retains higher rates of high-income earning Black residents than Philadelphia, and is actually more commensurate with Atlanta than you might think. So my take is Baltimore is gotta embrace its Maryland narrative and its regional identity, because the city-only story will not do it justice. I'll stop going much nerdier than that, because a couple other questions came in, but definitely down to talk more, Anand. Rudy asks, how do I identify the right people within my organization and existing network to collaborate? Great question. In crafting an ecosystem story, how can I ensure the strategic alignment of my organization's individual objectives with a narrative in a way that amplifies the collective value prop? Great question, Rudy. And I see a couple other questions. So Rudy's first question: how do I identify the right people within my organization? I mean, the short answer is, like George Bush taught, coalition of the willing. Sorry, that was a troll. Coalition of the willing. The people who want to do it are the right people, almost always. Because people don't want to be part of a storytelling strategy for all number of reasons. You know, they might not be as bought in as they think they have to be. They can just be nervous and unwilling to do it. So you start with the people who want. Sorry, I'm just continuing to read the question. So the answer is want. You're gonna gather a meeting or an event and see who comes, and that is the starting point. Even if it's 5 people, like you can start this with 2 or 3 people in an organization or even in a region. In crafting an ecosystem story, how can I ensure the strategic alignment of my organization's objectives? Yeah, so Rudy's also basically asking a marketing question. And if any of you have marketing backgrounds, you know attribution is really hard. You know, John Wanamaker, the famous retailer, has the old joke that gets shared. Half of what I spend on advertising is wasted. The problem is I'm not sure which half. And we see that all the time with storytelling. How do you know which stories are going to resonate? How do you know which investments are going to have the longest term? We at Techne have examples of some low traffic stories that we still hear about, had an emotional impact. What matters more? As a rule, I think all of us tend to over optimize on that which we can quantify, but we miss out on impacts that we can't quantify. So, Rudy, start with a coalition of willing. You are gonna have to find some small examples that can tie to your individual goals. Like that just the example becomes, what can you quantify? So we're gonna do some stories, but really we're gonna count newsletter subscribers as our preferred metric. And so we're gonna try to build newsletter subscribers. It's not perfect. It's not totally telling you it's the best storytelling, but you have to just pick a metric. And that's how you're gonna like justify it organizationally, that I can move some number, keeping in mind a bigger vision that comes back to that value prop. Similarly, Rudy, happy to talk offline separately. Amy asks, with a lot of stakeholders and hundreds of companies doing great work, how do you think about scalability when producing stories and get lost in the noise? Yeah, I mean, I'm friends with the longtime editor of a very large, like, global news site whose like name you all know, and doing beers with him many years ago, I always remember him saying that on an average day they do 500 stories, and it was something like 90% of their daily audience comes from maybe a dozen of those stories. So even at the highest scale, true international website, probably one of the 100 best trafficked websites on the planet, most of it does just get lost to the noise, even at that scale and at that level of professionalism. I think the answer is the internet is always going to gobble stuff up. The shorter answer is it takes time. I think that is the central reason that people get storytelling wrong so often is it takes time. There is no speeding it. You are going to spend months and years and you're going to keep honing it. And so how do you think about scalability? Start slow, start small, but start now and learn from there. Anon, how do we make sure that ecosystem building is not couched in the same working assumptions frameworks from the 70s and 90s, style of investment? What are the value systems that we need to have in ecosystem builders? And then how do we evaluate authentically we stick to it? Yeah, I mean, I think it is going to go back to that first step of what is unique about your region or your ecosystem. Like you just got to get that right first. So if your region's like, so Ohio, I don't know if there's anyone from Ohio on the call. Ohio is interesting because it is having strengths in return to reshoring, advanced manufacturing, chips like that. Some of it might sound like a 70s era story. We're trying to bring manufacturing back to the Midwest. It starts though with, but they have a bunch of very specific strengths. Their economic development organization strategies, unlike any other, it's a very specific state strategy that goes back 15 years. So in that case, Anon, they have to start with what is unique about our circumstances. So that's the way to not fall into the framework is what was true in 1978 still true for us, or how is it different? And how do we evaluate authentically? Here's another reason that many people struggle with storytelling. You have to give up control. If you too tightly decide this is what our regional or ecosystem brand is, and we won't let anyone deviate, it's not going to work because it's not going to be authentic. So you have to let people go off message, because the message is a Ouija board that many people have hands on. And so like, I'm a believer, obviously, that more stories win out. You begin to see honestly, it goes back also to Amy's question. If you can do more stories, you're more likely to get the big win, and you're more likely to find what seems to resonate and is truest anon. So we've done stories through the years of Technically that probably were reminiscent of older investments, but over time, it comes truer with more voices. Charlotte, thank you for your question. How much can an entrepreneurial support organization own a narrative about the regional ecosystem? All right, very relevant. Or is it more about collaborating with other organizations on media marketing outlets? That's a great question. So I think Charlotte, the way I want to answer that question is I feel like there's two ways that if I'm leading an ESO that I think about. As the leader of an entrepreneur support organization, you do have a responsibility to create some value for your own organization, even if that essentially, is benefits the whole ecosystem. And so I don't think you will ever own the narrative, but you can own a portion of the audience. And I think that's how you create value for your own individual ESO. So like, just to use the newsletter example, most newsletters suck. Most newsletters are boring. Most newsletters are not valuable. And the only people who are opening it are people who feel like they have to. You as the ESO organization can say, we're going to have the best newsletter for our ecosystem, and we're going to, it's going to be so valuable. We're going to have this direct relationship that has a degree of power. I don't mean that irresponsibly. I just mean that you have the direct relationship, you make those decisions. The narrative, though, I don't think you ever can totally control, at least authentically, to go back to Anon's point. So I think you have to give up a belief on knowing what the control is. You can pattern seek. I mean, to go back to that Philadelphia example, I was charmed by the Philadelphia group of Philadelphians saying that "we will still boo you" defines it. I certainly liked it as a resident, but that had to come organically. I didn't shove that in. That came after a long conversation, and it felt natural then when we came to it. So I think that idea of like owning the audience, but not the narrative, might be the distinction I would make. Other questions about your specific circumstance? I think we did great. I'm proud of us. I can leave with a final word. My only last point would be the Ecomap crew, more like from your own world of client basis. Ecomap rightly calling out the last question. I was more going to say, yeah, if Ecomap, if there's anyone that you're like, oh yeah, we always had this one ask from our group of clients. The long story to some is, oh, we got the last question. I'll read it and then we'll do it. From Megan on the LinkedIn. How can you prioritize the message when there are lots of options? Yep. For example, here in Massachusetts, we have strengths in lots of sectors without one clear sector narrative from a state perspective. We also want to tell stories of entrepreneurial success in towns and cities outside of Boston. Yeah. It can sometimes feel overwhelming to tell the story of an ecosystem that is made of many different ecosystems. Super great question, Megan. we've been publishing technically for 15 years, and over 15 years, we've employed probably a few dozen really great reporters, some of them on their younger side, not all though. And one thing that often trips up reporters who first join us in their storytelling beat is we are routinely the first bit of coverage that a company, that an entrepreneur ever gets. We're often their first interview. And routinely we'd have reporters would get tripped up because the entrepreneur had them so lost into the weeds of their particular initiative that it was like it's too hard to tell a story that anyone would want. And so I started pushing our reporters that if you ever feel lost in any storytelling initiative, if you're bored, if you're confused, if you're losing the thread, pause and stop and then ask, why do you live where you live? It is the most consistently effective question, particularly for our purposes of ecosystem building. And people naturally give you what you want. It's the least cluttered question there is. And in personal, we all are drawn to personal stories. So Megan, my answer to you, if I'm like Massachusetts state wide, I would take a step away from the sectors for a sec, because I tend to think that policymakers and economic development leaders and executives and industry partners and sponsors and funders care about sectors. I think people care less about them. Sure, they might need to move somewhere for a job, but like Massachusetts, for lots of reasons, you guys have a fabulous, like broad regional reputation. So it's the granularity of the people stories what matter most. So I think if someone asks me, how do I prioritize lots of options? I'd start with the people. And so why do people live in Massachusetts? And I would love to do more storytelling projects specific around satellite cities, mid cities, small towns. I grew up in a town of 5,000 people that has a couple small kind of innovation related firms. I think there's such interesting storytelling to be done there. So if any of us ever feel overwhelmed, stop and ask, why do you live where you live? And you will more often than not get more personal stories, particularly with like these, well, have a brilliant PhD or an entrepreneur who's so used to talking about their business that they are so boring that if you get them to talk about why they care about where they live, that matters more than anything. And at the end of the day, that's all of what we're doing is every one of us on this call is trying to better articulate why the place we live has magic. And the magic all comes from the people who call this place home. So ask them about it and then tell their story. Rudy drops in the chat. I'm not sure actually if you guys see the chat because I can't. But yeah, the Indiana Economic Development Corporation did in 2023 a yearbook. That was a cool project of gathering people's stories. I love it. If anyone want to nerd out about storytelling, my email is Chris, CHRIS at technical.ly. I love this stuff. I spent 15 years on it. Love to talk to you guys about it too. Thank you, EcoMap.
Thank you, Chris. We appreciate you being on our lovely ecosystem talk today. And we appreciate all the great insights and anecdotes that you stated as well. If whomever wants to get in contact with the wonderful Chris, I'm sure he has many stories to share with us. You can connect with him at Chris at technical.ly, as well as with his LinkedIn as well as you would like to see great ecosystem storytelling in action on technically.com. I encourage you to all subscribe, right, to not only get all the insight of your entrepreneurial ecosystems and ecosystem builders just in Baltimore and Philadelphia, but just all across the country. It's really great info to share. So I'm about to drop that into the chat, and then anyone else has any questions and would love to stay on, we can.
Thanks, friends. See you on the internet.